Okay, we're going to start notes over imperialism, which can be found in chapter 27 and 27 section 1, 27 section 4 in your textbook. In these chapters, we're focusing on imperialism, or European imperialism in Africa, and British imperialism in India. What exactly is imperialism? Well, this is what we're going to take our notes over, and this is what you guys are going to find out during these notes, and hopefully by the time we get finished, you'll have a better understanding of what imperialism is. Imperialism is the takeover of a country or territory by a stronger nation with the intent of dominating the political, economic, and social life of the citizens of that nation. You guys can obviously read that. But in layman's terms, imperialism is just when a country goes in, takes over all of the aspects of that nation, and basically assumes control of that nation. And that's what was going on before World War I in Africa. Europe was taking advantage of Africa, trying to go into Africa to take control of their countries and exhaust their natural resources and raw materials for the use of England's new industrial revolution. Imperialism. Okay, now we're going to go through the different types of imperialism that you can have. The first type being the most obvious, the one that you've talked about the most, colonization, where a country is governed totally by a foreign power. The next type of imperialism would be a protectorate nation, and that's when a country has its own government, but it's under outside control, so almost kind of like a protector, protector of an outside power. Another way is a sphere of influence, and a sphere of influence basically just means that that outside power is going to stake claims on an exclusive investment or trading privileges in that country. So they're going to have sole claim over certain trading privileges. And economic imperialism is when a country is independent but is not as developed, and it's controlled by private business interests rather than by other people's governments. So, for instance, an example of this would be like when the Dole Pineapple Fruit Company is controlling all of the pineapple trade in Hawaii. They were economically imperialist over that territory. So here are other forms of control that an imperialist nation can have. They can have direct control, where foreign officials are brought in to rule, and the nation itself has no self-rule, and it's usually based on a European style of a government. And the goal of this is to assimilate, or for the local population to absorb the ways and culture of the European power that has come in. Another set of control that you could see in imperialism is indirect control, and that's when local government officials are used, so they don't send in any foreign power, and that country has got a limited range of self-rule, so they do have some aspects of self-rule. And the goal is based on European government, but they're using local rulers. So the goal here is to develop future leaders that can rule and that can develop into developed nations and rule themselves. So those are kind of the different forms of imperialism. Some examples of direct control would be like when the French had colonies in Vietnam and Somaliland, and when the Portuguese had colonies in Angola. And indirect control would be like the British colonies in Nigeria and the United States colonies on the Pacific Islands. So those would be some examples of having. Imperialism really starts in Africa. What happens is there's this minister from Scotland named David Livingstone, and he travels into the interior of Africa to search for the source of the Nile. Well, he kind of disappears. No one has heard from him or his party for quite some time. And an American newspaper columnist or editor, or an American newspaperman, Henry Stanley, he's hired to go in and see if he can find Dr. Livingstone. And he does find Dr. Livingstone on the internal parts of Africa, living on the shores of a lake. After he goes into the interior of Africa, he makes 2 more trips. And in 1822, Henry Stanley goes in, and he's able to get the African leaders to sign treaties that give King Leopold II of Belgium personal control of their lands. And he was able to do that with the Congo. So this kind of started when King Leopold II was able to get Henry Stanley to go down into Africa, get these treaties signed so that King Leopold himself personally would have access to the Congo. Leopold, he said at the beginning, I want to end the slave trade. That's my goal here in the Congo. But it really was not that. That was not his goal at all. Once he exhumes control, he licensed companies. He forces the Africans to work. He taxes the citizens excessively. He's extremely brutal to the Congo, the people, native people of the Congo. And many humanitarians start to demand change. By 1908, the Belgian government actually goes in and takes over the Congo, and it becomes the Belgian Congo eventually. But Leopold's takeover of the Congo in 1882 really alarms France and kind of sparks other European nations that they need to go in and get ahead of the game and start taking over different areas of Africa, because they realize the natural resources and the raw materials that they... Okay, so let's talk about some of the motives. Why were these people imperializing? Why was Europe scrambling to get all these colonies in Africa and Asia? Well, first of all, as we've talked about in class, the Industrial Revolution was one huge motivating factor for the imperializing of Africa and Asia and the need for colonies, because they needed places to obtain raw materials. They now have these businesses established, and now they need markets for these businesses as well as new raw materials. And the Europeans have established these new businesses, so this is going to give them a superior advantage over some of those African nations that are weak and have unstable governments. Also, the idea of nationalism, which is something that we have talked about in class periods before. Europeans are now going to view an empire as a national greatness, and the larger that their land holdings are, the better that they're going to be. So if a European nation can get a whole lot of colonies, then that means they're going to be able to build a large empire, and they're very proud of that. And that's what they wanted to do, is to expand and make their nation into a vast empire. Economic competition. Each nation wants to get as many colonies as they can so that they can get as many raw materials, as many markets as they can. Same motivation behind early globalization and colonization. People wanting to obtain colonies for their wealth and for their growth of their empire. Other things were racism. Europeans felt like that they could take over other countries because the people living in those countries were inferior. The white man's burden. It's a very common thing in that time for people to feel like because they carry the burden of the white man that they need to take the ideas, their ideas, their European ways down to people in Africa and people into Asia, and spread that to those people and make sure that they are converted to Christianity and are living in ways that would be quote unquote civilized to the European mind. So that was another reason for people to go down into Africa especially and take control of those areas. And the last would be missionaries. Missionaries were there to spread Christianity. They wanted to teach them Western practices. Again, this white man's burden to spread religion and spread ideas so that the uncivilized, quote unquote, peoples in Africa could have a taste of Western civilization. And they felt like because that's what they were doing, that it was okay and that it was... Europeans had the advantage, and I apologize, this looks like it's cut off here, but I'll read it for you. Europeans had an advantage. They had a technological advantage over a lot of these weaker nations. First of all, they had the machine gun, the Maxim gun, which is, there's a picture of it right here. This is a Maxim gun. They had that technology that the Africans didn't have. They a lot of times were relying on very low-end, very primitive weaponry, so they had no way of fighting off these European superpowers. Also, the Europeans had the steam engine, so they could control their empire. They could move up and down rivers with the steamboat. Also, with railroads and other communication technology,
that really helped the Europeans have a leg up on the Africans who didn't have any of that technology in order to either combat the Europeans or run their own nations very efficiently. Another really, really important thing that made it very easy for the Europeans to come down, we know about malaria in Africa, and the Europeans were very susceptible to it. But the drug called quinine, it was protected the Europeans from the disease. So they were able to get a drug that protected them, quinine, from malaria. Also in Africa, some things that were going on that made themselves really susceptible to attack or to take over. They had a lot of ethnic strife. They had lots of ethnic wars between the different cultures and the diversity. There was also a lot of different cultures in that one continent. So they weren't very unified. They were very diverse. Also, low levels of technology. They didn't have the weapons, they didn't have the technology like we talked about earlier, so that made them extremely susceptible to being taken over by a stronger nation. Okay, the Berlin Conference. We talked about earlier, we talked about economic competition between the nations. We talked about the fact that the reason why a lot of these nations went after these colonies, went after these countries in Africa, was to get ahead. Well, war was starting to become a problem. A lot of the European nations started to fear war. They started to think, okay, if we don't get something settled, if we don't come up with an agreement, then we're all going to start competing with each other for these nations to the point of war. So to prevent a war, 14 nations meet at the Berlin Conference, and that goes from 1884 to 1885, and it basically lays down the rules for dividing up Africa. And what's kind of interesting about the Berlin Conference is no one from the African nations was consulted about the Berlin Conference. What it does is the nations basically set up this rule. Any nation can claim land in Africa by notifying other nations and showing that they can control the area. So the Europeans say, okay, if you notify other European nations and you prove that you can control that area, then that's your area. And then they divide up the rest of Africa among other nations with no regard to ethnic groups and without even consulting or considering the African rulers that were already in place. So it kind of shows no regard for what the government that was already there. After this was over, Liberia and Ethiopia remained the only independent nations not owned by a European nation at the end of the Berlin Conference. So it's kind of a sad thing. You can see that the different European nations basically came in, and at the Berlin Conference they said, okay, stake your claim, say what you want, and didn't have any kind of consult with the African rulers. Okay, so we know that imperialism is going in and taking control of a nation and using them for the country's benefit. So it's a lot like colonies and colonialism. We know a lot about that. In India, we talked about India briefly at the beginning of the semester about the Mughal Empire. What ends the Mughal Empire is basically the British East India Company, which we've talked about, takes over the Mughals, and the East India Company pretty much rules India. So a business company starts to rule India without any interference from the British government. Now, technically, the British government's in charge, but it's being completely ruled by the East India Company. And the East India Company had what's called a sepoy army, and the sepoys were just the Indian soldiers that fought under the British officers in the army. India was known as the jewel in the crown. It was an extremely valuable colony for the British. So because of that, the British placed a lot of restrictions on India operating its own economy. They would not allow them to produce raw materials for themselves. They could only produce raw materials for the British. They could only buy British goods. So it had an effect on lots of the textile factories. It had lots of effect on the Indian business and the Indian industry. So that was a negative thing that was imposed by the British. However, in India, the British set up railroads, and these railroads were done to transport raw materials to ports. So they would transport those raw materials to ports to take back to Britain to be used in industry, and they would bring back manufactured goods that were being brought in from England. So while this was used for the English, the British set up their railroad system in India, which was a good thing. The British helped and oppressed India's people. We've kind of been talking about. They had a railroad system now. So after imperialism, the British helped them to set up their own railroad system, and they helped with their sanitation. They helped them to get more modern. They built telephone and telegraph lines, built dams and bridges. They really helped to sanitize India and to really help it become more and more modern. However, the British had all the political and social power. They restricted Indian-owned businesses and industry. They increased the presence of missionaries, and they had a lot of racism toward Indian people. Although in the late 1800s, the British said they had a social policy where they were going to stay hands-off with the social life or the religious life of the Indian people, they still had a Christian presence, and a lot of times that would offend some of the Indian people. So at this time, many of the Indian people are going to have some growing discontent with the British that are there to rule. First of all, they are going to start to suspect that the British are there to convert them to Christianity. They also are going to kind of reject a lot of the racism that the English are that are expressing to the Indians, and they are going to have just some lingering feelings of discontent as this starts to happen. So this is going to spark a sense of nationalism and a sense of resentment against the British government and against the British who are there in India. And this is eventually going to cause some stir that's going to eventually lead to rebellion. Like we know, a lot of times when countries and people start to have nationalist feelings, that's going to start uprising. So in 1857, the Sepoy soldiers, or the Indian soldiers, they get a rumor that their new guns have been sealed with beef and pork fat. And in order to use the cartridges, you had to bite off the seal. And so in doing that, they would have been having to touch the beef and pork fat. And that was very unsettling, since many of these soldiers were either Hindu, who hold the cows to be sacred, or Muslim, who do not eat pork. So this outraged these Sepoy soldiers and leads to a rebellion. And these Sepoy soldiers, they rebel against the British Army in what is known as the Sepoy Mutiny. And basically, at this time, it takes the British East India Company over a year to regain control over the Sepoy Army. And this mutiny, this rebellion, is going to cause even more distrust and more tension between the British and the Indians, and it's going to spark a nationalist movement for independence in India. And so this nationalist movement is going to lead to eventually India gaining its independence from Great Britain. Queen Victoria's involvement. Well, Queen Victoria was the Queen of England at this time, and she becomes the Empress of India. And she is a very interesting character because she is very much known for her charitable works and her social reforms in England. And the era of her reign is known as the Victorian Age, and she is very much held to a high regard and is a very influential Queen of England. And she's very known, being the Empress of India, for supporting that religious tolerance in India. And so she is held to a very high regard by the English people at this time. All right, so let's do a quick check. On your paper, if you will write the answers to these questions, we will be checking them in class. What was the motivation for Europe to expand and imperialize Africa? What is the impact of imperialism on Africa and Asia? And then on the third one, I want you to form an opinion. Do you think it was right for Europe to spread its influence to other places like Europe, Africa, and Asia? And then I want you to tell me why or why not from your opinion. All right, I will see you guys in class. Make sure to have the questions ready.